The light never quite behaved properly in the great hall. It struck the compressed ice walls at angles that should have been impossible, fractured through crystalline pillars that had taken 3 centuries to grow, and emerged as ribbons of color that danced across the vaulted ceiling like aurora borealis trapped indoors. Princess Syrith had stopped finding it beautiful somewhere around her 70th year of rule. Now it was simply there, like her throne, like her title, like the endless parade of suitors who thought themselves clever enough to be the first. The current candidate was from the Talashan Confederation, which meant he'd arrived with approximately 7 tons of luggage, and an entourage whose primary function seemed to be gasping appreciatively at his every utterance. His name was something with too many syllables. Syrith had learned decades ago that remembering them only made the rejections more awkward, and he was currently comparing her hair to captured starlight, which was at least more original than the usual spun gold nonsense her previous suitors favored. "Your luminescence," he continued, apparently unaware that he'd been using the wrong honorific for the past 10 minutes. "I come bearing gifts from 17 worlds, each chosen to reflect a facet of your incomparable beauty." Syrith sat motionless on the throne of eternal winter, her blue skin catching the refracted light in a way that made her appear to glow from within. It was an effect her ancestors had engineered into their biology specifically for moments like this, back when they'd cared about impressing others. Her blonde hair, which did indeed flow like captured starlight thanks to trace amounts of photoreactive proteins, cascaded over shoulders bare except for the traditional frost crystal jewelry that marked her rank. The long, elegant points of her ears caught the light as well, swept back in a style that conveyed polite attention while her mind wandered to the crystallography problem she'd been working on that morning. The merchant prince, she was relatively certain that's what he was, gestured to his attendants, who began hauling forward containers of various exotic materials. Silks that changed color with the viewer's mood. Gems that sang in harmonic frequencies. A small, rather confused-looking creature in a gilded cage that appeared to be some kind of chimera between a songbird and a houseplant. "This is Chirpleaf," the suitor announced proudly. "The only specimen in existence. It photosynthesizes and performs arias from the Melodian opera cycle. I had it created specifically for you." The creature released a warbling trill and sprouted a leaf from what might have been its shoulder. Syrith felt a familiar weariness settle over her like frost. "How thoughtful," she said, her voice carrying the precise warmth of a star going supernova several galaxies away. "Though I must confess concern for Chirpleaf's long-term happiness in captivity." "Oh, it doesn't experience happiness," the suitor explained cheerfully. "The genetic engineers removed that to make it more docile. It only experiences the urge to sing and photosynthesize. Very simple." "How efficient." Syrith's tone could have frozen the gas giant that loomed beyond her palace's walls. She caught movement in her peripheral vision, Thessa, her chief advisor, making a subtle gesture that translated roughly to "Please don't freeze him to the floor. We just had it refinished." The merchant prince launched into a prepared speech about uniting their commercial empires, creating a trade dynasty that would span sectors, and something about leveraging synergistic market penetrations that made Syrith briefly consider whether abdication might be preferable to another hour of this. Her people's longevity was usually considered a blessing, but at moments like this, she wondered if living for centuries was simply evolution's way of ensuring someone would be around to maintain the diplomatic niceties. "Your proposal is most comprehensive," Syrith said when he finally paused for breath. "I particularly appreciated the 17-page appendix on freight optimization. However, I must respectfully decline." The gasping entourage went silent. This was always Syrith's favorite part, the moment when certainty crumbled into confusion, when the suitor's practiced confidence encountered the immovable fact of her refusal. "Decline." The merchant prince blinked as though she'd spoken in a language his translation implant couldn't process. "But I've offered you everything. Wealth beyond measure, political alliance, that bird plant thing. Indeed you have, Syrith agreed. And I'm certain these gifts would be treasures to someone seeking wealth, political alliance, or genetically modified curiosities. Unfortunately, I am not that someone. Then what do you want? The question emerged with genuine bewilderment, and Syrith felt an unexpected flicker of something almost like sympathy. Almost. That, she said softly, is a question 300 suitors have failed to answer correctly. The merchant prince departed with considerably less fanfare than he'd arrived with, his entourage silent except for the confused warbling of Chirpleaf, who would hopefully find a better home somewhere in the palace gardens, where the groundskeepers had a talent for rehabilitating unwanted diplomatic gifts. Thessa approached the throne once the great hall had emptied, her elderly frame moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had earned the right to complain. Her ears, longer than Syrith's by virtue of age, drooped slightly with concern. 300, Thessa said without preamble. A nice round number, very significant, some might say legendary. Some might say ridiculous, Syrith countered, rising from the throne with a grace that belied her exhaustion. Did you see that creature? They removed its capacity for happiness. I saw. I also saw you not turn him into an ice sculpture, which shows admirable restraint. Thessa's expression shifted, the humor draining away. We need to discuss the reports from the border stations. Syrith felt her stomach tighten. More sightings. 17 in the past week. Strange ships, running dark, appearing at the edge of our sensor range and then vanishing. The patterns match nothing in our databases. They walked together toward the observation balcony, their footsteps echoing through corridors lined with ice sculptures depicting Vaelthara's history. Conquests, alliances, the Great Isolation, all frozen in time, quite literally. The balcony overlooked the gas giant that Vaelthara orbited, a swirling mass of storms and pressure systems that made weather prediction look like a casual hobby. You're going to tell me isolation isn't working anymore, Syrith said, not quite making it a question. I'm going to tell you that the galaxy has changed while we've been perfecting our frost sculptures and rejecting suitors, Thessa replied. The connected worlds are mobilizing. Something's coming, and they're preparing to face it together. And we're preparing to face it alone, as we have for a century, as you have chosen. Syrith leaned against the balcony railing, feeling the cold crystal against her palms. Below, the moon's surface glittered like a fractured mirror, each facet a testament to the ancient technology her people had developed before deciding the rest of the galaxy wasn't worth the trouble. There's a human delegation requesting an audience tomorrow, Thessa continued. They've been quite insistent, used every diplomatic channel available and invented 2 new ones. A human suitor. Syrith felt the weariness return. That would be novel, at least. I don't think I've rejected any humans yet. Not a suitor, a diplomat. He's requested a formal audience to discuss what he's calling a matter of mutual survival. Thessa paused. He also accidentally filed his request through our agricultural department and spent 3 days arguing with someone about grain subsidies before they redirected him. Despite herself, Syrith laughed, a sound that surprised her with its rarity. Well, that's different. When does this diplomat arrive? His ship entered orbit an hour ago. He's asked to meet at your earliest convenience, which he's defined as immediately if possible, yesterday if you have time travel technology, and please for the love of all that's holy before something terrible happens. Dramatic. Desperate, I'd say. Thessa's expression grew serious. Whatever those ships at our borders are, the humans know about them, and they're frightened enough to come asking for help from a princess who's legendary for saying no. Syrith looked up at the gas giant's storms, watching lightning arc between cloud layers millions of kilometers thick. Somewhere beyond that roiling chaos, strange ships moved through space with unknown intent. And tomorrow, a human who apparently couldn't navigate basic bureaucracy would stand in her great hall and ask her for something. She found herself almost curious about what it would be. "Tell him Dawn," she said finally. "And Thessa, make sure someone explains that your luminescence isn't my proper title. I'd hate for him to spend the entire meeting getting that wrong too." Kael Dervan had been awake for 47 hours, had jumped through 17 star systems in 3 weeks, and was currently standing in what he'd been assured was the anteroom to the Great Hall, but looked more like the inside of a kaleidoscope having an existential crisis. The walls refracted light in ways that made his eyes water, and he was reasonably certain the floor had just shifted beneath his feet, though that might have been the sleep deprivation. "You're certain this is standard protocol?" he asked the attendant who'd been assigned to escort him, a young Vaelthari woman whose name he'd already forgotten despite her repeating it 3 times. "Perfectly standard," she assured him, though her expression suggested she found his question amusing. "The refraction chambers help visitors acclimate to the palace's harmonic frequencies. Otherwise, the resonance can cause temporal disorientation." "Temporal disorientation," Kael repeated flatly. "You mean I might experience time differently?" "Only by a few seconds per hour, barely noticeable once you adjust." Kael made a mental note to include "Palace causes time distortion" in his mission report. Right after, accidentally spent 3 days arguing about grain subsidies with Agricultural Ministry, and before honestly not sure if I'm qualified for this anymore. His uniform showed signs of hasty repairs, a torn seam at the shoulder badly restitched, a scorch mark on the sleeve from a plasma conduit failure on the transport ship, and what appeared to be coffee stains that had achieved permanent resident status. The attendant led him through a series of corridors that seemed to exist in multiple spatial dimensions simultaneously, which Kael's training manual had definitely not covered. His briefing on Vaelthara had been thorough on the political situation: isolated crystalline moon, ruled by an ancient princess who'd rejected 300 suitors, possessed technology nobody quite understood, but light on practical details like bring sunglasses and prepare for architecture that violates Euclidean geometry. They emerged into the Great Hall, and Kael's first coherent thought was that someone had taken the Aurora Borealis, compressed it into a building, and then taught it to show off. His second thought was that he desperately needed to not think about how beautiful it was, because he had approximately 8 minutes to convince a legendary monarch to share technology that might save humanity before the void swarm consumed another dozen worlds. Princess Syrith sat on a throne that looked like winter given physical form, and Kael's exhausted brain immediately classified her as terrifying before adding also blue, which wasn't in the briefing materials. Her blonde hair caught the light in a way that suggested either advanced genetic engineering or someone had figured out how to weaponize aesthetics. The pointed tips of her ears rose above her hair like elegant accusations, and her expression conveyed the warmth of a star going supernova in a neighboring galaxy. The attendant began announcing him with a formal recitation that included his full name, titles, organizational affiliations, and apparently his mother's maiden name for some reason. Kael let her finish, then stepped forward and did not kneel. The gasps from the assembled courtiers sounded like a small wind instrument section had collectively inhaled wrong. Kael ignored them, pulled out his battered data tablet, and activated the holographic projector he'd been carrying since leaving human space. "Your Highness," he said, deciding that if he was going to break protocol, he might as well break it comprehensively. "I apologize for the breach of etiquette, but I don't have time for the traditional approach. I need to show you something, and I need you to actually see it, which means skipping the part where everyone pretends this is a social call." Syrith's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a minute adjustment that suggested he'd surprised her. "You've traveled 17 systems to skip the pleasantries." "I've traveled 17 systems because 17 systems from here, there's nothing left." Kael activated the projector, and the great hall filled with images that made the beautiful refractions of light seem suddenly obscene. Planets stripped to metallic cores, their atmospheres torn away like tissue paper. Space stations that had been home to millions reduced to expanding clouds of component atoms. Fleet formations that had simply ceased to exist between one sensor sweep and the next, leaving only the screams on emergency channels and then silence. "This is the Void Swarm," Kael said, his voice stripped of diplomatic niceties by exhaustion and necessity. "We don't know what it is. We don't know where it came from. We know what it does. It consumes matter and converts it to energy, breaking molecular bonds at a quantum level. It doesn't communicate. It doesn't negotiate. It just spreads system to system, eating everything in its path." He cycled through more images, each one a testament to destruction on a scale that made warfare seem quaint. A mining colony where 10,000 people had lived and worked, gone in 47 minutes. A defensive fleet of 80 ships reduced to scattered atoms in less time than it took to evacuate. A garden world where forests had grown for millennia, now a barren rock with an atmosphere composition reading trace elements and screaming. "We've tried everything," Kael continued, aware that he was probably committing multiple diplomatic violations but too tired to care. Kinetic weapons pass through them. Energy weapons feed them. Nuclear devices just give them more matter to consume. We've lost 16 worlds in 8 months, and the swarm is accelerating. Syrith stood, descending from her throne with movements that suggested she was taking his presentation seriously, which was honestly more than Kael had hoped for. "And you've come to us because 3 weeks ago we detected something unusual. A swarm ship entered the Crystalline reaches, your neighboring sector, and encountered a merchant vessel using Vaelthara drive technology. The swarm ship hesitated, pulled back, avoided contact." Kael pulled up the sensor logs, showing the bizarre dance of approach and retreat. "Your crystalline technology emits harmonic frequencies that seem to interfere with the swarm's ability to process matter. We don't understand why. We just know it's the only thing that's made them hesitate." "So you want our technology," Syrith said, and Kael couldn't quite read her tone, anger, interest, resignation, all of the above. "I want an alliance," Kael corrected. "We share what we know about the swarm's patterns. You share the principles behind your crystalline harmonics, and we work together to develop a defense that might actually work before there's nothing left to defend." One of the courtiers, an elderly woman whose ears drooped with age, stepped forward. "You're asking us to abandon a century of isolation for the sake of species we've deliberately avoided." "I'm asking you to help us survive," Kael said bluntly. "And if that's not compelling, I'm pointing out that the swarm doesn't care about your isolation. It's 12 systems away and moving in this direction. You can help us stop it now, or you can face it alone in approximately 6 months when it arrives at your doorstep." He was aware he was being aggressive, probably ruining any chance at diplomacy, but the images still hung in the air, those dead worlds, those silent stations, and he couldn't find it in himself to be polite about extinction. Syrith studied the holographic displays with an intensity that suggested she was actually processing what he'd shown her rather than preparing a diplomatic rejection. "You're human," she said finally. "Your species is relatively new to this sector. Why should we believe your analysis is accurate?" "Because we're dying," Kael said simply. "Because 17 systems ago I had a team of 12 people. Now I have 4, and I'm not sure if the other 3 are still alive because communications keep getting cut off when the swarm takes another relay station. Because I've spent 3 weeks jumping through space on minimal sleep trying to find someone who might have technology that could help. And your crystalline harmonics are the only thing that's made the swarm hesitate even once." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small data chip, walking forward to place it on the steps leading to her throne. The courtiers tensed as though he might be delivering a weapon, but Kael was too exhausted for subtlety. "That's everything we know about the swarm's movement patterns, attack strategies, and consumption rates. It's also the last messages from 16 different worlds before they went silent. You don't have to trust me. You don't have to like humans. You just have to read that data and decide if you want to help stop it or wait until it arrives here. Syrith picked up the data chip, turning it over in her blue fingers. You didn't bring gifts. You didn't prepare speeches comparing me to celestial phenomena. You didn't even kneel. Your Highness, with all respect, I don't have time to court you. I have time to ask for help saving both our species, and if I've violated protocol doing it, you can have me executed after we figure out how to stop the thing that's eating the galaxy. The elderly advisor made a choking sound that might have been horror or suppressed laughter. Syrith's expression remained unreadable, but Kael thought he saw something shift in her eyes, calculation, perhaps, or possibly just amusement at his diplomatic disaster. You're either incredibly brave or catastrophically foolish, Syrith observed. I'm incredibly tired, Kael corrected. And I accidentally spent 3 days arguing about grain subsidies because I filed my meeting request through the wrong department, so I'm going to add catastrophically foolish to my list of qualities. But I'm also right about the swarm, and you know it, or you wouldn't still be standing here listening to me instead of having your guards throw me out. Syrith held up the data chip, light refracting through it to create tiny rainbows across her palm. I'll review your information. Return tomorrow at the same time, and we'll discuss whether Vaelthara will consider your proposal. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the rejection Kael had expected. He nodded, managed something approximating a respectful bow despite his exhaustion, and let the attendant escort him back through the kaleidoscope corridors toward whatever passed for guest quarters in a palace that bent spacetime for architectural effect. Behind him, the great hall's lights continued their dancing display, and Princess Syrith stood holding a data chip full of death and destruction, wondering when exactly her perfect isolation had started to feel less like protection and more like a prison of her own making. The war room smelled like old ice and newer anxiety, which Syrith decided was an improvement over the usual scent of old ice and older dust. The chamber hadn't been used in 43 years, not since the brief territorial dispute with the Kelvin Principality that had been resolved when both sides realized they were arguing over a moon that was mostly composed of frozen methane and regret. Now the holographic tactical displays flickered to life, with images of something far more threatening than resource disputes, and Syrith found herself wishing for the simplicity of arguing over worthless real estate. Kael sat across from her at the obsidian strategy table, looking marginally more rested than he had the previous day, which meant he'd upgraded from walking corpse to person who'd recently visited a walking corpse and caught whatever it had. His human physiology apparently required more sleep than her species, a limitation that seemed both inconvenient and vaguely endearing, though Syrith wasn't prepared to examine why she found exhaustion endearing. I read your data, she said, manipulating the holographic controls to bring up the swarm's progression patterns. 3 times. The 3rd time I had Thessa read it as well to confirm I wasn't hallucinating the horror. It does have that effect, Kael agreed. My first briefing on the swarm, I thought someone had accidentally sent me a draft of a terrible science fiction scenario instead of actual intelligence reports. Then I watched a sensor recording of the swarm consuming a cargo freighter in real time, and I realized that reality had become substantially worse than fiction. Thessa, who had installed herself in the corner with the determined presence of someone who knew her opinion, would be needed whether invited or not, cleared her throat. The consumption rate is accelerating. If the pattern holds, the swarm will reach Vaelthara in 5 months and 17 days, not 6 months. Wonderful, Syrith muttered. We're being consumed ahead of schedule, very efficient. Kael pulled up a secondary display showing the incident with the merchant vessel, the moment where the swarm had hesitated, retreated, avoided the ship using Vaelthari drive technology. This is the only documented case of the swarm actively avoiding something rather than just failing to consume it. The harmonic frequencies your crystalline drives emit seem to cause some kind of disruption in their matter conversion process. Our drives work by resonating with the quantum structure of space itself, Syrith explained, falling into the rhythm of technical discussion with a relief that surprised her. Most suitors glazed over when she mentioned crystallography. We generate standing waves at specific frequencies that allow us to fold space without actually traveling through it. The crystals act as both the power source and the navigation system. Could you create a weapon based on that principle? Something that broadcasts the same frequencies on a larger scale? Syrith cycled through the data again, watching the swarm's retreat play out in slow motion. Possibly. But weaponizing the drives would require reconfiguring our entire crystalline matrix network, and that's not something we can do quickly. These structures took generations to grow. She gestured toward the walls, where faint lines of crystal veined through the compressed ice like frozen lightning. Every building, every ship, every piece of technology on this moon is part of an integrated harmonic system. Changing one frequency means recalibrating everything else. How long would it take? Kael asked, and Syrith heard the weight behind the question, time measured against consumption rates, mathematics written in extinction. Years. Maybe decades. She watched his expression fall and added, however, we could create focused resonance projectors much faster. Smaller scale, mounted on ships or defensive platforms. They wouldn't destroy the swarm, but they might create zones it can't enter. A shield rather than a sword, Kael said. I'll take it. How many ships would you need to protect? That depends on how many ships humanity has that are worth protecting. Kael laughed, a sound that carried equal parts exhaustion and genuine amusement. We have approximately 300 defensive vessels spread across 7 remaining core systems, plus maybe twice that many civilian ships with weapons bolted on in places weapons were never meant to be bolted. We've gotten creative with our engineering since the swarm arrived, also desperate, mostly desperate. 300, Syrith repeated, against a force that consumed 16 worlds. In our defense, we're really hoping the defensive part of defensive vessels isn't just aspirational. Kael pulled up fleet positions, showing humanity's remaining forces clustered around their core worlds like children afraid of the dark, which wasn't far from the truth. We've consolidated around high-value targets, population centers, industrial hubs, the research station where someone might figure out how to stop this. We're not trying to hold territory anymore. We're just trying to survive long enough to find a solution. Thessa moved to the table, her elderly frame somehow radiating more authority than the elaborate military regalia Syrith's previous advisors had favored. You're asking us to commit our resources to defending humanity's remaining worlds. What does Vaelthara gain from this arrangement besides the warm feeling of altruism? Besides not being consumed by an extinction-level threat in 5 months, Kael asked dryly. We have quantum communications technology that's faster than anything in this sector. Military manufacturing capacity that can convert a civilian facility to weapons production in weeks. And honestly, we're really good at improvising under pressure, which seems like a useful skill when facing an enemy that keeps adapting. You're offering us desperation and efficiency, Syrith observed. I'm offering you allies who know how to fight an impossible enemy because we've been doing it for 8 months and we're still here, which frankly surprised us as much as anyone. Kael leaned forward, his exhaustion temporarily buried under intensity. Look, I know the traditional diplomatic approach involves elaborate negotiations over trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and probably some kind of ceremonial gift exchange where everyone pretends to like the gifts. But the swarm doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care about isolation. It definitely doesn't care about proper protocol. It just eats everything, and if we don't work together, it's going to eat us separately. Syrith found herself studying him with an attention she rarely gave to diplomatic meetings. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't reciting carefully prepared speeches designed to appeal to her vanity or her sense of duty. He was simply stating facts with the blunt force of someone who'd run out of patience for anything else. It was possibly the most refreshing conversation she'd had in decades. "I need to see the swarm for myself," she said abruptly. "Not recordings, not censored data. I need to observe it directly to understand how our resonance frequencies affect it." Kael blinked. "You want to go to the front lines. I want to understand what we're fighting. Your data is comprehensive, but I can't develop effective countermeasures without direct observation of how the swarm interacts with harmonic fields." Syrith stood, pacing to the window where the gas giant loomed beyond. "Besides, I've spent a century making decisions from the safety of this palace. Perhaps it's time I saw the consequences of those decisions up close." "The consequences of your decisions have been continued existence," Thessa interjected. "Isolation has kept us safe." "Isolation has kept us comfortable," Syrith corrected. "Safety is apparently about to become negotiable whether we like it or not." Kael was staring at her with an expression that suggested he was recalculating several assumptions. "Your Highness, with respect, frontline observation missions aren't typically conducted by heads of state. We have combat analysts who can gather data and—" "Combat analysts who don't understand crystalline harmonics the way I do," Syrith interrupted. "This is my technology, my people's legacy. If I'm going to commit to defending your worlds, I need to know exactly what we're defending them against." "She's going to do it regardless of whether you approve," Thessa said to Kael with the tone of someone who'd been fighting this particular battle for decades. "You might as well accept it now and save time." Kael ran a hand through his hair, which Syrith noticed was attempting to escape in multiple directions at once. "Okay, fine. We'll arrange a reconnaissance mission to the nearest swarm contact point. But I'm coming with you, because if you get consumed by the extinction-level threat I flew 17 systems to ask for help against, my superiors are going to be extremely disappointed in my diplomatic skills." "Your superiors are probably already disappointed in your diplomatic skills," Syrith pointed out. "You didn't kneel. You compared formal protocol to a waste of time. And you filed your meeting request through the agricultural department. That last one was an accident." "Was it though?" Syrith smiled, surprising herself. "You strike me as someone who might deliberately file through the wrong department just to see what happens." "I'm going to invoke diplomatic immunity on that question," Kael said, but he was smiling too, the expression transforming his exhausted features into something almost lighthearted. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll need time to prepare the resonance detection equipment and brief my ship's crew on the mission parameters." Syrith turned back to the tactical displays, watching the swarm spread patterns calculate themselves across the holographic star map. "Thessa, coordinate with Kael's team on quantum communication protocols. If we're going to observe the swarm, I want real-time data transmission back to the palace." "You're actually doing this," Thessa said, and Syrith heard something between pride and terror in her advisor's voice. "I'm considering it. There's a difference. The difference being approximately 12 hours of pretending you might change your mind, before doing exactly what you've already decided." Syrith didn't argue because Thessa was right, which was annoying but also why she'd kept the woman as her chief advisor for 6 decades. Instead, she dismissed them both and stood alone in the war room, watching the holographic representation of the swarm spread across the galaxy like a disease, wondering when she decided that confronting extinction sounded preferable to rejecting another suitor. The observation ship was called Resonance in the original Vaelthara, which translated to something like, "the sound ice makes when it dreams," in human standard, a phrase that had made Kael question whether translation software was sophisticated enough to handle poetry. The vessel itself looked like someone had carved a ship from a single massive crystal and then taught it to fly, which according to Syrith was exactly what her ancestors had done 7 centuries ago when they decided conventional spacecraft were boring. Kael stood on what passed for a bridge, though it resembled a greenhouse more than any command center he'd trained on. Crystalline panels curved overhead, showing space in directions that shouldn't have been possible given the ship's actual position. Syrith sat at what he assumed was the pilot's station, though she wasn't touching any controls. Instead, she had her hands resting on two crystalline columns that pulsed with soft blue light in rhythm with her breathing. "The ship responds to harmonic resonance," she'd explained during their departure from Vaelthara. "I think the navigation patterns and the crystals interpret my intent and translate it into propulsion. It's more efficient than manual controls and significantly more intuitive once you've trained for 3 decades to establish the neural pathways." 3 decades, Kael had repeated. "That's longer than I've been alive." "Yes, I gathered that from your youthful enthusiasm for filing documents incorrectly." Now they were 3 hours into their journey toward the nearest swarm contact point, a mining outpost that had gone silent 2 days ago. Kael's human tactical team had confirmed the swarm's presence there via long-range sensors before communications had ceased entirely, which meant they were about to observe an active consumption event. The thought sat in his stomach like a cold stone, heavy and uncomfortable. "You're nervous," Syrith observed without looking away from whatever she was seeing through her crystalline interface. "I'm about to watch an extinction-level threat consume a facility where 3,000 people worked yesterday," Kael said. "Nervous seems inadequate. I'm hovering somewhere between terrified and wondering if I should have updated my will before we left." "Did you update your will?" "I don't actually have a will. I'm 28, and until 8 months ago, my most dangerous work experience involved negotiating trade agreements with species that considered mild disagreement to be a declaration of war." Kael moved to one of the observation panels, watching the stars slide past in ways that suggested the ship was traveling through space that had been temporarily convinced it was somewhere else. "What about you? Century of rule must come with significant estate planning." "I've updated my will 17 times, Syrith said. "The current version leaves everything to Thessa with instructions to use the treasury to fund a research institute for advanced crystallography. The previous version left everything to the palace gardens, with a note that plants were better conversationalists than most courtiers." "You left your estate to plants. They don't try to marry me for political advantage." It seemed reasonable at the time. Kael laughed despite his nervousness, which he suspected was exactly why she'd mentioned it. He'd noticed over the past day that Syrith had a particular talent for diffusing tension with absurdity, as though she'd spent decades learning how to make people forget they were talking to ancient royalty and remember they were talking to someone who'd once left her kingdom to gardening equipment. The ship's harmonic alert system chimed with a sound like wind through crystal caves, which Kael's translation implant helpfully informed him meant approaching destination with moderate probability of danger. Syrith's hands moved slightly on the crystalline controls, and the observation panels shifted to show the mining outpost ahead. What had been a functioning facility now looked like someone had started erasing it from reality and gotten bored halfway through. Entire sections of the station simply ended in smooth curves where matter had been converted to energy, leaving edges that gleamed with an unsettling perfection. Ships that had been docked were now half-ships, their forward sections consumed while their aft sections drifted in stable orbit like monuments to interrupted engineering. "They're still here," Syrith said quietly, and Kael saw them then, the swarm ships, if they could even be called ships. They looked like geometric impossibilities, shapes that hurt to focus on because they occupied more dimensions than human eyes were meant to process. They moved through space without visible propulsion, simply existing in one location and then another as though travel was a suggestion they'd chosen to ignore. "How many?" Kael asked, activating his recording equipment to capture data his superiors would never quite believe even when shown proof. 7 distinct entities, possibly more. It's difficult to count things that exist partially outside normal spacetime. Syrith manipulated the ship's sensors, and holographic displays materialized showing energy readings that made no sense according to conventional physics. They're converting matter at the atomic level and storing the energy in quantum fields that shouldn't be stable. The math is beautiful and terrifying. Only you could find the extinction of humanity mathematically interesting. I didn't say interesting, I said beautiful. There's a difference. Syrith's hands moved in complex patterns, and the ship began broadcasting harmonic frequencies that Kael felt more than heard, a resonance that made his bones vibrate sympathetically. Watch what happens when I introduce the Vaelthara drive harmonics. The swarm ships responded immediately. Their impossible geometries shifted, pulling back from the observation vessel like water retreating from oil. One of the entities that had been consuming what remained of the mining outpost simply stopped, its matter conversion process freezing mid-consumption, as though it had encountered something unexpected and needed time to process the information. "It's working," Kael said, watching sensors confirm what his eyes were showing him. "They're avoiding the harmonic field." Not avoiding, hesitating. Syrith increased the harmonic output, and the swarm ships retreated further, their geometries becoming even more unstable as though the frequencies were causing interference in whatever physics they operated under. They're trying to adapt. See how that one is shifting its dimensional profile. It's attempting to find a frequency range where my harmonics don't affect it. Kael recorded everything, his tactical training warring with the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. How long before they adapt completely? Unknown. Minutes, hours. They're learning faster than I expected. Syrith reduced the harmonic output slightly, and immediately one of the swarm entities moved closer, testing the boundaries of the field. Fascinating. They're coordinating their adaptation attempts. Each entity is trying a different frequency range and sharing the results with the others. That's extremely disturbing information delivered in an extremely calm tone. "Would you prefer I panic? I can panic if it would make you feel better." "Please don't. One of us panicking is enough, and I've claimed that role for this mission." Something changed in the swarm's behavior. The entities that had been retreating suddenly stopped, and Kael felt the hair on his arms stand up, as though the universe was building toward something unpleasant. The nearest swarm ship began emitting its own harmonic frequency, a discordant sound that made the observation vessel's crystals ring in protest. "They're attempting counter-harmonics," Syrith said, her calm finally cracking slightly. "That shouldn't be possible. They shouldn't be able to generate harmonic frequencies at all." The ship shuddered as the swarm's counter-harmonics intensified, and Kael grabbed onto the nearest crystalline column to steady himself. "Can we leave? I'm suddenly very in favor of leaving." "Agreed, retreating now." Syrith's hands moved in rapid patterns, and the observation vessel folded space around itself in ways that made Kael's stomach briefly forget which direction was supposed to be down. The swarm ships pursued for several seconds before falling behind, unable or unwilling to follow through whatever dimensional shortcut Syrith had taken. They emerged back in normal space several light hours from the mining outpost, and Kael spent a moment reacquainting himself with the concept of linear time and stable spatial coordinates. That was educational and horrible. Educational, horrible, and extremely concerning, Syrith corrected, pulling up the sensor recordings and reviewing them with an intensity that suggested she was seeing implications Kael had missed. They adapted in real time, not just avoided the harmonics but actively tried to counter them. That's not mindless consumption, that's intelligent response to a novel threat. Intelligent extinction-level threat, wonderful. That's exactly what we needed to make this situation better. Syrith cycled through the data again, her blue fingers moving through holographic displays with practiced efficiency. "We can create defensive fields based on the harmonic principles. Large-scale resonance projectors that maintain frequencies the swarm hasn't adapted to yet. But they're learning, which means whatever defense we build will have a limited operational lifespan before they counter it." "How limited?" Impossible to calculate without more data. Weeks, months. She looked at him directly, and Kael saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that her century of isolation had failed to prepare her for threats that learned and adapted faster than policy could be written. We need more ships, more data points. If every vessel uses slightly different harmonic frequencies, we can force the swarm to adapt to multiple variables simultaneously, which should slow their learning process. You're talking about coordinating defensive harmonics across an entire fleet. I'm talking about not being consumed in 5 months when the swarm arrives at Vaelthara. Syrith stood, moving to stand beside him at the observation panel where stars had returned to behaving in conventionally explicable ways. Your human ships, can they be retrofitted with crystalline resonance projectors? Probably. We've gotten good at bolting things onto ships that were never designed to have things bolted onto them. Kael pulled up fleet specifications on his own display, already running calculations about mass, power requirements, and the likelihood that military engineers would accept crystal technology without extensive testing that they definitely didn't have time for. How many projectors can you manufacture? With full palace resources, maybe 50 in the first month, more as we scale up production. She paused, and Kael saw her calculating something that went beyond simple manufacturing logistics. I need to contact the other crystalline worlds. The ones Vaelthara has been avoiding for the past century, because I decided isolation was preferable to complication. You're ending the isolation. I'm adapting to new information, which apparently the swarm isn't the only one capable of doing. Syrith smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. A century of rejecting alliances, and now I'm about to start collecting them because the alternative is extinction. Thessa is going to say, "I told you so," for the next decade. She seems like the type who's earned it. She absolutely has, which is what makes it annoying. They stood together watching the stars, and Kael found himself thinking about the mining outpost, the 3,000 people who'd been working there, the half-ships drifting in stable orbit like interrupted thoughts. We're going to lose more stations before we figure this out. Yes, Syrith said simply, but perhaps we can prevent losing everything. That seems worth attempting. Kael nodded, already composing the report he'd need to send back to human command. 1 part tactical analysis, 1 part desperate hope, and 1 part explanation for why he'd taken ancient royalty into active combat zones without proper authorization. His superiors were going to be furious right up until they saw the data, at which point they'd probably be furious and grateful simultaneously, which seemed to sum up his entire diplomatic career lately. The observation ship began its journey back to Vaelthara, carrying sensor recordings of intelligent extinction and the fragile beginning of an alliance built on shared desperation, and the hope that adaptation wasn't solely the swarm's domain. The sky above Vaelthara's observation balcony had turned the color of bad decisions and worse timing, which Syrith reflected was appropriate given that the void swarm had arrived 3 weeks ahead of their most pessimistic projections. The crystalline moon's defensive systems hummed with harmonic frequencies that made the air itself vibrate, and somewhere below, 50 newly manufactured resonance projectors were being distributed to the fleet of human and Vaelthari ships that had assembled in orbit over the past month. Kael stood beside her, looking considerably less exhausted than when they'd first met, though that might have been because he'd upgraded from catastrophic sleep deprivation to merely chronic anxiety about extinction. His human military uniform had been replaced with something that incorporated Vaelthari crystalline threading, which Thessa had insisted was necessary for harmonic protection, and definitely not because she decided humans looked better with some aesthetic improvement. "They're adapting faster than we calculated," Kael said, watching the swarm ships materialize at the edge of the system like geometric nightmares given physical form. "That's 47 entities. We expected maybe 30. Yes, but we have 63 ships now instead of the projected 50, so we're overperforming on our end too. Syrith manipulated the tactical hologram floating between them, showing the defensive formations they'd spent weeks coordinating. Human aggression and mobility combined with Vaelthari precision and harmonic technology, each ship broadcasting slightly different frequencies to force the swarm to adapt to multiple variables simultaneously. Also, the Kelvin Principality sent 17 support vessels, which surprised everyone including probably the Kelvins. The ones you almost went to war with over a methane moon. The very same. Turns out impending extinction makes previous territorial disputes seem charmingly quaint. Syrith activated the palace's primary resonance system, and the entire moon began broadcasting harmonics that made the gas giant storms visible from orbit seem to pulse in sympathy. Although they did request formal apology for the methane moon incident as part of their alliance terms, which Thessa drafted as, "We're very sorry your moon was mostly regret." That's not an apology. It's a Vaelthari apology, which is the best they're getting during an active invasion. The swarm ships moved closer, their impossible geometries shifting as they encountered the harmonic fields being projected by the defensive fleet. Several entities hesitated exactly as they had at the mining outpost, their matter conversion processes stuttering when confronted with frequencies that interfered with their quantum field manipulation. But others pushed forward, already adapting, their dimensional profiles reconfiguring to find ranges where the harmonics had less effect. Second-wave defensive positions. Kael spoke into his communication implant, coordinating with the human fleet commanders who'd been skeptical about crystal technology right up until they'd seen it make the swarm retreat. Focus fire on the entities showing adaptation resistance. Let the harmonics handle the hesitant ones. Syrith watched the battle unfold across multiple tactical displays, feeling the palace's crystalline structure resonate with each harmonic pulse. Her people had built this moon as a fortress 7 centuries ago, back when they'd still believed involvement in galactic affairs was worth the cost. Now that technology was being used exactly as intended, and she found herself wondering what her ancestors would think about their princess finally remembering why they'd built defenses in the first place. A swarm entity broke through the outer defensive perimeter, its geometry stabilizing as it adapted to the primary harmonic frequencies. Immediately, 3 human ships adjusted their approach, weapons firing in coordination with harmonic pulses from Vaelthari support vessels. The entity's dimensional profile destabilized, its matter conversion process reversing briefly before it retreated back beyond the defensive line. "It's working," Thessa said from her position at the tactical command station, her elderly ears perked forward with an intensity that suggested she'd forgotten to maintain her usual dignified composure. "They're learning, but we're forcing them to learn in multiple directions simultaneously. They can't adapt fast enough." "They will eventually," Syrith countered, watching 3 more entities push forward with geometries that suggested they'd already started sharing adaptation data with each other. "This buys us time, not victory. Time is victory if we use it to build more defenses." Kael pulled up projections showing resonance projector production rates across 4 different worlds: Vaelthara, 2 human industrial centers, and the Kelvin Principality's manufacturing stations that apparently excelled at building things quickly when properly motivated by existential dread. "We've got 17 more worlds interested in alliance terms now that they've seen the swarm can be slowed. By next month, we could have 3 times our current defensive capacity." A proximity alarm chimed with the musical tone of crystals under stress, and Syrith saw a cluster of swarm entities attempting a coordinated breakthrough on the palace's direct orbital path. She increased the harmonic output, feeling the strain as the palace's ancient systems pushed beyond their designed operational parameters. The entities retreated, but not before one of them managed to clip the edge of a human destroyer, consuming its port weapons array in the seconds before defensive harmonics forced it back. Casualties? Kael asked, his voice tight. 17 injured, structural damage contained, came the response from the destroyer's commander. We're still operational and extremely annoyed. Maintain position and try to be less annoyed at the extinction-level threat, Kael replied, which Syrith noted was probably not standard military communication protocol, but seemed to work for humans and their preference for emotional honesty during combat. The battle continued for another 3 hours, a grinding test of adaptation versus coordination, and slowly the swarm began to retreat. Not defeated, Syrith knew better than to call this victory in any permanent sense, but deterred, pushed back by defensive fields they couldn't quickly overcome. The entities withdrew to the system's edge, their geometries pulsing with what might have been frustration if such things experienced emotion, which seemed unlikely but not impossible given their demonstrated intelligence. They'll be back, Syrith said as the last swarm ship vanished from sensors. Stronger, more adapted, probably with new strategies we haven't anticipated. And we'll be here, Kael replied, watching the fleet regroup and begin damage assessment. With more ships, better harmonics, and increasingly desperate allies who have realized isolation isn't actually a survival strategy. Syrith looked at him, this human diplomat who'd arrived without gifts or prepared speeches, who'd broken protocol and accidentally filed documents through agricultural departments, who'd somehow convinced her that a century of isolation was less sustainable than the terrifying prospect of connection. You're staying, then, on Vaelthara. Someone needs to coordinate the human side of this alliance, and apparently I'm qualified despite my catastrophic approach to bureaucracy. He smiled, and Syrith noticed he looked almost comfortable on her observation balcony, as though he'd found a place that made sense even when nothing else did. Also, Thessa threatened to reject all future human diplomatic credentials if I left, and I'm fairly certain she can actually do that. She absolutely can. She's rejected 7 different diplomatic missions over the past century, usually for excellent reasons involving their representatives being insufferable. Was I insufferable when I arrived? You were exhausted, tactless, and willing to skip every social convention in favor of preventing extinction. Syrith turned back to the tactical displays, watching the defensive fleet reposition itself into the formation they designated optimistic preparation for inevitable round 2. I found it refreshing, which should probably concern me but doesn't. Below them, the palace's great hall was being converted into a coordination center, where representatives from 15 different species were arguing about defensive strategies, resource allocation, and who got to sit closest to the resonance projector controls. Thessa was managing the chaos with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades organizing ceremonial events for diplomatic visitors. Except now, instead of arranging formal receptions, she was preventing interspecies conflicts over tactical command structures. She's enjoying this, Kael observed, watching Thessa separate 2 arguing military commanders with a glare that could have frozen the gas giant storms. Don't tell her I said that. She knows. She told me yesterday that a century of managing suitor rejections was excellent preparation for managing military alliances, and both involve dealing with people who think they're more important than they are. I'm adding that to my report under cultural observations that explain everything about Vaelthari diplomacy. Syrith laughed, the sound carrying across the observation balcony and mixing with the harmonic hum of the palace's defensive systems. 300 suitors over a century, and not one of them had made her laugh like this. Not from elaborate gifts or poetic speeches, but from the simple absurdity of facing extinction with someone who saw her as a war leader and occasional disaster at bureaucratic filing, rather than a prize to be won or a legend to be conquered. The other crystalline worlds sent formal alliance requests, she said, pulling up diplomatic communications that had been arriving steadily since the battle's conclusion. 6 different governments who spent the past century ignoring Vaelthara's isolation are now extremely interested in our defensive technology and coordination strategies. Are you going to reject them? You're very good at rejections. I'm considering accepting them, which Thessa says is a sign I've finally learned something after a century of stubborn isolation. Syrith manipulated the communications, reviewing terms that ranged from reasonable to ambitious to one government that had apparently tried to include a clause about favorable trade agreements for decorative crystals. Although I'm rejecting the Tessarian Confederation, because they tried to sneak in marriage proposals disguised as military alliance terms, which shows a disappointing lack of creativity. 301 rejections. That's a nice round number. 301 suitors rejected, but approximately 40 alliance requests accepted in the past month, so I'm diversifying my diplomatic portfolio. Kael moved to stand beside her at the balcony's edge, where the gas giant storms had returned to their usual magnificent violence now that the swarm had retreated. You've changed your entire civilization's foreign policy in 4 weeks. That has to be some kind of record. It's what happens when someone arrives and refuses to treat you like a prize or a legend or an ancient relic to be collected. Syrith looked at him directly, seeing not the exhausted diplomat who'd stumbled through her agricultural department or the tactical coordinator who'd helped defend her world, but something more fundamental, a person who'd offered alliance instead of courtship and somehow accomplished what 3 centuries of admirers could not. You saw me as someone who could help save both our species. Everyone else saw me as someone who could enhance their status. To be fair, you can probably do both, but one of those seemed more urgent given the extinction timeline. That's always so practical. It's deeply annoying and also why this alliance might actually work. Below them, the fleet continued its reorganization. Ships from a dozen different species coordinating defensive patterns that would have been impossible a month ago, when Vaelthara still believed isolation was sufficient protection. The swarm would return. Syrith had no illusions about that. But when it did, they'd face not scattered, desperate worlds but a growing alliance that was learning to adapt as quickly as the enemy it opposed. I should address the Coordination Council, Syrith said, not quite ready to leave the balcony but knowing duty didn't pause for contemplative moments. They'll want to know the palace's defensive systems performed adequately, and we're not all about to be consumed. Tell them we're about to be consumed in a very organized fashion with excellent harmonic support, Kael suggested. It'll boost morale. That's terrible advice. And yet you're smiling. She was, Syrith realized, smiling at the prospect of addressing a council of military commanders and diplomatic representatives, speaking not as an isolated princess, rejecting another unwanted proposal, but as a war leader coordinating the defense of species she'd spent a century avoiding. The throne of eternal winter waited below, relocated from the frost-rimed Great Hall to a chamber with windows facing the stars and the assembled fleet, transformed from a symbol of beautiful isolation into something stranger and more necessary. A seat from which to build alliances instead of reject them. 300 suitors over a century, and in the end, it was the diplomat who hadn't pursued her at all who'd changed everything, showing her that the one being who saw her as an equal rather than a prize had accomplished what centuries of adoration never could. The swarm would return, adaptation would continue, and extinction remained a mathematical probability hovering somewhere between inevitable and merely likely. But for now, standing on an observation balcony with a human who'd accidentally revolutionized her entire foreign policy through catastrophic filing errors and tactical desperation, Syrith found herself thinking that connection, terrifying, complicated, and requiring constant adaptation, might be worth the cost after all.